Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Please take your seats. If you haven't taken your seats, if you want to sit down, you can sit at the back. If you have not sat and there's an empty space in front of you, please just move forward. That would be great. Can you hear me, everyone? Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me? Lift your hands up if you can hear me. Great. So if there's a seat in front of you, please move forward so we can start. Oh, I can see more people coming in. Welcome, welcome all of you. Okay, great. My name is Stephanie Ayura Makroma. I work as a coordinator for women in renewable energy in Africa. I also work as a director for impact with the Center for Green Growth in Ghana as well, and I'm a representative of UONGO. Now this evening, most of you already know what we are here to do. And one of the first things we are going to note is that we are here to speak about the role of gender equality for a just, sustainable, and climate resilient energy transition. And our supporting organizations and co-organizers is the UNIDO, it's FAO, it's UN Women, and WFP. Now, this event, as we've already said, is jointly hosted by these team of people, and it's going to explore the nexuses of climate action, SDG 13, sustainable energy, SDG 7, gender equality, SDG 5, food security, SDG 2, clean water, and sanitation. It's so many times all of these things are discussed individually, but the nexus of all of these coming together are not explored. What we are going to spend our time doing today is discussing how all of these things work together in relation to the contribution of gender equality for just sustainability and climate resilient energy transition. So I will not speak too much. I'm going to invite our very first speaker to give us an opening brief. I'll introduce him shortly. Our very first speaker, as I introduced him in a previous conversation, he prefers very, very short introductions, and so I'm going to keep it as short as I can. Our speaker is Tariq Mtara, Director of the Division of Decarbonization and Sustainability at UNIDO. Tariq, now I'll give you the opportunity to come speak to us next. Thank you. Please clap for him.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good evening. I know that perhaps this event is the last one between you and the parties at the end of 1 week of negotiations. But I think the topic we're discussing is important. Warm welcome. As Stephanie mentioned, I work for UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And it's my pleasure to be here with you in this joint event that we are convening with our partners, UN Women, the World Food Programme, FAO, on these intersectional relations between the different SDGs, particularly in the context of gender equality and making progress on sustainable energy, SDG 7, gender equality, SDG 5, health, SDG 3, food security, SDG 2, and clean water and sanitation, SDG 6. I think I was just in the session before this one, and I was tremendously inspired by the kind of conversation I've heard from young women that actually came to the heart of the issue we're debating today. And it made me think that we do, as UN agencies, have a tremendous responsibility to actually step up our action and step up for the energy transition. to co-lead a gender and energy compact to catalyze actions toward a gender equality and women's empowerment to accelerate a just, inclusive, and sustainable energy transition. Fundamentally, under the action agenda of this energy compact that we are coordinating with many partners, there are 5 areas where we need to make progress on if we are truly to get anywhere on this. Energy, eliminate energy and time poverty. We need to ensure in all type of policies and planning a gender responsive energy. We want to see more women in the energy entrepreneurship space and in the ownership of the energy assets and infrastructure. A 4th one is about career advancement, avenue for women working in the energy sector and productive employment. And finally, tools and knowledge and data that actually are responsive to the kind of knowledge that we need to make decisions, particularly gender disaggregated data that can actually help decision making. 5 priorities. What I fundamentally think is that we cannot make any progress on these without tackling the fundamental issues of equal access to power and resources at the heart of these issues. It's the big elephant in the room. We always talk that we need to make tools, policies, progress on many of these issues, but equal access to power and resources is at the heart of this issue. So, and I hope that this panel discussion will inspire us to tackle some of these structural problems of equal access to power and resources. Without equal access to power, we will not make progress on gender equality and a just energy transition. So that's my opening remark to welcome you to this session, and I hope we tackle the core issues impeding and derailing us from making any progress. So welcome and looking forward to the discussion.
I honestly think we can do it better for him. Please clap for him again. Next, I'm sure most of you already know this lady. Her name is Elizabeth Wathuti. Elizabeth has been a key advocate and an activist. She's an environmentalist, she's a climate activist, she's a founder, she's of the Green Generating Initiative. Miss Elizabeth Wathuti is a Wangari Maathai Scholarship Awardee, and that is not an easy award to get. Shall we please welcome Miss Wathuti to give us the keynote of this event.
Thank you. Earlier this year, I visited Wajir County, which is about a day's drive northeast of my home in Nairobi, Kenya. And what I witnessed there was a deeply shocking example of the suffering that the interconnected nature, food, and climate crisis are bringing to bear right now across the African continent, and in particular on women. 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons have led to terrifying levels of food and water insecurity across the region. I saw with my own eyes the terrible suffering that the community in Wajir is experiencing, and the stories that the local people had to share with me will never leave me. Most people in Wajir depend on livestock for their livelihood, but thousands of their animals are now dropping dead of thirst and starvation. As the drought continues, families have nothing to fall back on. Without the money to pay school fees, it's usually the girls who are pulled out of school. And often they're married off in order to receive dowry as payment. Young brides then become young mothers. but their babies are also failing to thrive because their mothers' own bodies are starved of proper nutrition and they cannot produce enough milk to feed them. Of course, I am not the only one who is witnessing how the drought in Kenya is having devastating impacts on the women and the girls. My dear friend and fellow climate leader, Abigail Kima, went to Isiolo County earlier this year, and she told me about her experiences there. She told me about how, because water sources have completely dried up, women are having to walk extraordinary distances just to fetch water. The wells that do remain are dangerous. Abigail said that these wells are often deep and surrounded by quicksand with no living vegetation left to hold the earth in place. She heard about someone being buried alive inside one of those wells. It collapsed as they were gathering water. And we know that as water becomes more scarce, the girls and women become more and more vulnerable to gender-based violence, both inside and outside of their homes. The combination of severe stress and a lack of water to carry out domestic chores is also exposing women to a sharp rise in domestic violence. And the cases of rape are also becoming more and more rampant. Abigail heard that some of the women are now choosing to head to the water source at midnight in order to avoid long queues with their daughters. And another dear friend and fellow climate leader, Vanessa Nakate, recently visited moms and their children who are facing starvation in Turkana. Their children of water, food, and access to life-saving health services. Vanessa spent time with moms who are desperately trying to keep their young ones alive, trying to find food and water to sustain their families, and also every other day they have to walk for long distances as well to find water. She met one mom and her son in a hospital where the worst cases of severe acute malnutrition are being referred to. Unfortunately, this mom had not been able to access proper services in time for her son to receive the treatment that he needed. Vanessa said that this condition is sometimes called wasting because that is what happens to the children who suffer from it. They are quite literally wasting away before your eyes. And by the time the sun set in the evening, sadly, this little boy had passed away. People who have done nothing at all to create the climate crisis are suffering these unbearable losses every day. And this gross injustice is precisely what hundreds of young people here at COP27 and millions around the world are mobilizing to fight against. But women are not only victims, they can also lead us out of this crisis if they are properly empowered to do so. The great Professor Wangari Maathai understood the power of women to address environmental crisis. And in 1977, she founded the Greenbelt movement to support rural Kenyan women whose streams were drying up, whose food supplies had become insecure, and who had to walk farther and farther to get firewood and water. Wangari encouraged and supported the women to work together to grow seedlings and plant trees, to bind the soil, store rainwater, provide food and firewood, and even receive a small monetary token for their work. Empowered in this way, the women began to have more and more of a say in how their communities were run, and they also began to advocate for greater democratic space and more accountability from their leaders. 45 years on, hundreds of thousands of women have been involved and over 5,000 nurseries have been established. More than 51 million trees have been planted on farms, in schools and churches, along the rivers, and even in the countryside. Today, women are facing an extreme version of what Wangari Maathai witnessed in the 1970s. And once again, the empowerment of girls and young women can be massive part of the solution. A recent report from the Malala Foundation has found that closing gender gaps in education can help countries better adapt to the effects of climate change and decrease the rate and impact of global warming. The report also found out that when girls go to school, they learn the skills to overcome climate-related shocks, like the critical thinking capabilities that are needed to process and even act on the risk of weather reports. Countries that have invested in girls' education have suffered far fewer deaths from droughts and floods than countries that have lower levels of girls' education. This report also found that if every girl was able to access her sexual and reproductive health and rights through quality education and had access to modern contraception, it could reduce total emissions from fossil fuels by 37% to 41% by the end of the century. Project Drawdown also had a ranking of top 100 solutions for transformative climate action. And it also estimates that investing in universal education and family planning in low and middle income countries could reduce emissions by more than 85 gigatons by 2050. And that's about a decade's worth of China's emissions. They list the empowerment of girls and young women as one of the top 10 most impactful ways to address the climate crisis. Empowering women is not just about education and family planning. It is also about putting their voices at the center of decision-making spaces. I have seen reports that only 7 out of 110 world leaders who attended this COP are women. That is 6%. The gender balance of the negotiating teams is better, but the heads of delegation are still predominantly male. Women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, but they also have the potential to solve it. When you're trying to solve a crisis, you don't want to leave half of the people who could help you solve it on the sidelines, or worse even, silence them, abuse them, and leave them to suffer the most unbearable impacts. It is the high time we empowered girls to become the leaders we need. And it is the high time we center the voices of women. It is the high time that we work together to get on solving with this crisis by making sure that we include women and girls as part of the entire decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We'll move on to our next speaker, or speakers. But before we go, we understand from the opening, from the keynote, that women and youth are disproportionately impacted by the effects and impact of climate change. At the same time, they are at the forefront of climate action. Women are the backbone of rural economies with high participation in the agricultural sector. That's play an essential role in achieving food security, which also requires access to water and energy. Sustainable energy as well plays an important role for climate change mitigation. However, it can also play a key role in adaptation in reducing climate vulnerability of women and therefore fostering gender equality and women's empowerment for a just transition. On one hand, decentralized renewable energy can create income opportunities for women, which enhances their adaptability and their ability to cope with the climate crisis. At this point, I think it's time for us to hear from our speakers, our distinguished, esteemed panelists. And I'll take my time to introduce them properly. I can see some of them smiling at me already. So the very first person I'm going to introduce to the panel is Elizabeth Nyamayaro, the special advisor to the WFP. Please have a seat. Please clap for her. The mic, please. Thank you, Madam, for clapping till she sat. I appreciate that. The second person I'm going to introduce to the panel will be joining us online. It's Kosa Bano, a gender and adaptation specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Please clap for her wherever she is so she can join us. Our next speaker is Joyce Reese, climate justice lawyer, Manila Observatory. Please clap for her. Our next speaker is panelist is Brandy D. Kali, founding partner, from a box. He'll be joining us online. Please clap for him. Our next speaker and panelist is Jeline Connors, Chief of Staff for Clean Cooking Alliance. Jeline, please join us up here. Thank you. And our final panelist, as you all can see on the screen, is Gareth Phillips. He's a Climate Finance Division Manager. Please clap for while he's coming up. Please clap for him. Thank you, our esteemed panelists. I hope each one of you has a mic so that it'll be easier to answer the questions. Okay. So I'll start briefly. And I already like the smells. So this question in particular goes to you, Ms. Elizabeth. And women are the backbone of rural economies with high participation in the agricultural sector. We all know this, we all see this. And we have an essential role as women in achieving food security, which also requires access to water and energy. What is the role, in your understanding or opinion, that women can play in making our societies more climate resilient, in particular at the nexus of water, energy, and food?
Yeah. Thank you so much, wonderful moderator, for this. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful question. I actually want to tell you a quick story. A friend of mine works for an international organization in Kenya, and he visited one of the communities that had been impacted by climate change. And while he was there providing food packets to the communities, he met a young girl who was 6 years old, and her name was Nafu. And she had come with a mom to collect the food packets. She was heavily malnourished. And my friend saw this young girl, and his heart literally broke. So he went to his boss and said to his boss, listen, is it possible to give this family extra food? So that thankfully the boss said yes. So week after week, the mother came to the station, she collected the food, and this went on for 3 months. One day she came back to the station to pick up the food, and she was wailing, and she was in agony. And when my friend asked what had happened, she said, my daughter died, Nafu passed away. And it didn't make sense to my friend. He's like, how is it possible? Because you've been collecting food for 3 months. And she looked at my friend and said, I have 5 other children, and I had to make a tough decision. I either had to give this food to this young girl, in which case I would save her life, or give it to my husband. If I gave it to my husband, then he would be able to go to work, and then I might be able to save my entire family. I mean, that is a decision that nobody ever has to make. And I share this story with you because this is the reality of what it means to be a woman in these communities. I grew up in a small village in Zimbabwe. I'm a village girl, as I like to call myself. Oh, there's a Zimbabwean over there. And it is the women in my community, not only in my community, but in all the vulnerable communities that I've visited as part of my work with the World Food Program, that are carrying the load. They are the ones going to fetch water. They are the ones going to fetch firewood. They are the ones cooking. They are leading within their own communities. And yet, somehow, there's a disconnect when it comes to these international forums where women aren't given the seat at the table. In any emergency crisis, as our work with the World Food Program, we are the largest humanitarian organization. We're in 120 countries and territories around the world. We are there really at the start of an emergency, and it is often the women that are doing all the work. They are first responders in a crisis. And so for me, it is actually quite disheartening to realize that we don't have the same appreciation, the same respect, and the same platforms and resources that should be given to women, yet they are doing all the work at the community level. And so for me, as my young sister Elizabeth said, women aren't only vulnerable in this issue, but they are also the solution, and there can be no development if women are left behind. I will share just sort of one quick story, in fact, in terms of the nexus between energy and food. One of our good example, our work with the World Food Program, we're working in northern Guatemala. And again, in a similar situation, it is a vulnerable community, it's a developing world. The community has no energy, and so when the sun goes down, and it's the same as my own community, it goes completely dark. And so they have to use firewood, they have to use kerosene to provide light for their families. I don't need to tell you what's wrong with that. Deforestation is a big issue. Also, they're inhaling fumes, which is really bad for their health. So what we did, we took 2 women, Marta and Kamalina, as part of a joint partnership with FAO, UN Women, and AFD, and we took them for a training in India where they learned how to assemble solar panels, manage solar panels, repair solar panels, and really understand the cost of implementation of clean energy. They went back to their community in northern Guatemala, and they were able to actually install solar panels for 100 families. I mean, that's remarkable. So now they can charge their phones, they can cook in a healthy way. So, I mean, just to sum it up, it is critical that we have women at the decision-making table.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move to the next person, but it's, as she said, it is critical to have women on the nexus for food, energy, so that we can achieve our climate goals. Now, our second question would go to Madame Stella Husseini Gama. She's here. Please clap for her. Please clap for her. Madame, can you join us up here? We'll be grateful to have you here. Please join us. Please clap for her while she gets here. Thank you so much. So I'm going to give a minute so that it can be a bit settled in and come back to it. Now I'll go to Joy Rees. As you're working on the ground as a climate lawyer with frontline communities, how do you see the energy, water, food nexus intersect with gender and youth dimensions?
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Reyes from the Manila Observatory in the Philippines. I just wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'd like to preface my answer by saying that the work that I do, I work with women and environmental defenders in the Philippines, as well as indigenous peoples. We also work with youth environmental defenders. And I'd really just like to highlight what Elizabeth said earlier in her keynote speech, where really, women, environmental defenders, indigenous peoples, they're at the front line of the climate crisis, but they're also our last line of defense. That's so much work. But also, where are the women? We know that women hold up half the sky, but where are the women in the tables? Where are the women in the negotiation halls? And so, I just kind of like to talk about how it is in the Philippines. We know that the Philippines is a climate risk country, not just because of its geographical location, but like it's very risky for environmental defenders as well. And so it's very palpable, this energy, food, water nexus, the need for it, particularly post-disasters. We already know that women look after the communities and the families because men have to go out and aid other people and maybe look for other help. And so with regard to water, I'll start with maybe the issue of water. So water, or clean potable water, is something that's very difficult to come by, especially in rural communities. And it's not just post-disasters. Even in regular times, they can be very difficult to access because one of the biggest issues is when development aggressors come in. Construction, land conversion, deforestation, resource extraction, these all destroy the purity of the water and the arability of the land. This destroys their health, this destroys the health of their children. And so there are many other issues. Rains come, but they're mostly in the form of floods. And then what's ironic is that we're an archipelago, so we're surrounded by water, but the waters that surround us are sullied, they're polluted, and they're dead. And so displacement, which also happens, means that water and food insecurity is very prevalent. And they take place not just when typhoons hit, when flash floods happen, or when landslides take place, but they also take place when companies, in the guise of development, come in and destroy their lands. And at this point, I think I'd just like to hammer the fact that it's not just fossil fuel companies that can fall prey to this. Even renewable energies can fall prey to this issue of displacing the women, displacing the youth. So the worst part is sometimes even these renewable energy corporations, they forcibly displace communities, which lead to resource insecurity. Hydropower energy, for instance, may displace them, for instance, water and solar. The worst part is the indigenous peoples, the women, the energy don't go to them. The energy generated goes to the center. They still have to rely on indigenous sources of power, and that's just not just transition. That's just not genuine energy transition. And so maybe the question that ought to be asked in all of the rooms and in all of the plenaries is not whether or not it is development, but because all of these is development. But the main question that we should be asking is development for whom? And that's, thank you. Thank you so much.
Please do it better for her. Development for whom? Thank you very much. Our second and third questions are going to go to Madam Hussaini Gama. Let me introduce her properly. The Deputy Director of Forestry, the Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Mining in Malawi. She's also a representative from the Least Development Country Group as well. Madam, your question is, what are the gendered impacts of climate change on women when it comes to the water, energy, food nexus, and what does this imply for climate change adaptation, in particular in your country, Malawi, and for the LDCs in a broader sense?
Thank you very much for that question. Once again, my name is Stella Gama. I'm the Director of Forestry in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change, Malawi. And I'm also a negotiator for the least developed countries. I follow technology and gender. The interactions among water, energy, and food are numerous and also substantial. We can go on and on tonight to highlight the specific interactions. For example, water in Malawi is key for agriculture, both for rain-fed water. Okay, great. Water in Malawi is key for agriculture, for the food production, both rain-fed and also irrigated agriculture. Water is also found in various bodies. We have the lakes, rivers, streams, and these provide numerous functions to livelihoods and also ecosystem services. Energy is key for driving the economy, but also for use at domestic level. We need energy in our houses for cooking and heating. Food, it's obvious. Food is life. Water is life. So energy is also life. These are interlinked. If we look at Malawi, the situation of Malawi, we have energy insecurities. A larger proportion of the Malawi population relies on biomass energy. And for them to access the biomass energy, we have to cut a lot of forests. So that results in forest degradation and deforestation. And this has impact on water. So it also has impact on the hydropower generation. When we have impact on hydropower generation, for example, when we had the cyclone Idai, the hydropower is not resilient enough to survive the cyclone Idai. So the power plant was wiped away. So that impacted on power generation. And this is because we have destroyed the uplands. They are bare. That's why the hydropower plant is not resistant. Now, because the hydropower is no longer adequate for domestic and industrial use, more and more forest resources are being extracted for domestic use. So the cycle, the vicious cycle, continues and it continues. And this also has impact on food production. So, in brief, that's how I can highlight the interlinkages. And for a least developed country like Malawi, it means the visions that we have set, for example, for 2030, for 2040, and for 2063, it will be difficult for us to meet these because we are energy insecure, we are also water insecure, and we are also food insecure. So the interlinkages now being exacerbated by climate change are making the least developed countries worse off. We have set high ambitions in the NAPS. We have set high ambitions in the nationally determined contributions. But at the rate we are going with the climate impacts, it is very difficult for us to achieve the national development goals, the ambition in the NAPS, and also the ambition in the NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can do it better for her. At the rate we are going, it's going to be difficult for Malawi to achieve the goals that are set. Is it practical? These are questions you should be looking at and be thinking about as we move on to the next speaker. So we'll be going online now. We're going to invite our next speaker, Brandy Dikal. Brandy Dikali, she's the founder and partner at Farm from a Box. The question we're going to ask her is, any Nexus management for food, water, and energy will need to include gender considerations throughout, particularly given women's key roles and responsibilities in food and this Nexus. How does Farm from a Box enhance food security and economic empowerment of women? Shall we go online now? Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This is an incredibly important discussion, and I'm honored to join my fellow panelists here today, and thank you for allowing me to join virtually. We are living in the most consequential decade of our time. What we do now for the next 10 years will determine the kind of future we all have. And listening to our fellow panelists, it's very clear that building a climate resilient future can only happen when the collective whole has equal access and agency in their lives. We cannot treat gender equality as a separate issue. Now, when it comes to the nexus of food, energy, water, health, I really believe it needs to be approached holistically and specifically through a localized lens. Each area has its own unique set of challenges, and there is not going to be a blanket solution to be able to meet everyone's needs. Now, at this point, to be able to really build climate resilience in our food system, we need infrastructural support systems to really help stabilize and localize our production and close those yield gaps. We designed Farm from a Box as an off-grid, decentralized modular farm system to be able to strengthen local and regional food systems by providing that technology that's necessary to increase production sustainably and more regeneratively. This is all for outdoor crop agnostic production. So it pairs together with what the local growing systems are. And where we're looking at energy, independent power is incredibly important, as we have already heard, to rural areas. It also serves to reduce farm emissions. Solar-powered drip irrigation and pumping, again, as we have heard, make sure that we're connecting these rural areas with water access. And with drip irrigation, we can help extend the growing season and stabilize crop production through drought conditions, which are increasing. Whether we're talking globally, they're increasing. We know this is a fact. Internal cold storage is also something that we integrated into our system to make sure that we are keeping those crops grown fresh and keeping them fresh longer, whether they are used for consumption or to take to the market as well. So while we designed Farm from a Box to be this infrastructural system, what we have found now, and really accelerated by COVID-19, is that perhaps its greatest potential is in using this system as, pardon me, a regionalized solution so that we can deploy it as a constellation within an entire region to be able to uplift agricultural value chains, so that we're really focusing on women farmers in particular. The beauty with this is, again, we're speaking about access. So while each one of these is a hardware infrastructural solution, what does it do? It changes the power dynamic. It helps uplift rural women farmers economically as well as nutritionally, and really helps build that resilience on the ground. Now, whether we're working with women farmers in Tanzania or an upcoming project in Liberia, or whether we're working with the indigenous Lakota women that are here within the United States, every single time we have seen common denominators that when these women have access to the technology that can uplift and stabilize their production, it trickles out into multiple enterprises. There's information sharing, there's knowledge sharing of different cultural and indigenous and local agricultural techniques, which are so important for regional resilience. And all of that extends out beyond agriculture. So I think one thing that's important too, and since I'm really coming from the private sector perspective within this panel, is not only is it important because it's the right thing to do to uplift women globally, and it's the just thing to do, but let's look at it from the opportunity that it also presents. When we are uplifting women and incorporating their perspectives and their understandings and their knowledge, we are removing the blind spots in the solutions that we can deploy for climate change. We understand things from a different perspective, and that is absolutely transformative. We also know that investing in women is less risky and yields higher returns. So the fact that this is still a conversation that we are having is absolutely absurd. We have to make sure that we are uplifting women throughout the entire spectrum, from top-down leadership levels to women and youth growing in the fields to be able to take stronger positions within their villages, within their communities, within their countries. That's how we're going to be able to really make change. And I think that we have to come together collectively to make sure that all women's voices are heard and have an equal playing field in the solutions that we're driving.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's important to look at this holistically and not in segments. It's also important to build an infrastructure that supports this. And it makes business sense to support women. Now we go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Korsa Banu. Korsa is a gender and adaptation specialist. I'm going to read out your question, Korsa. What are the gendered impact of climate change on women when it comes to the water, energy, food nexus? And what does this imply for climate change adaptation? In particular, your country in Nepal and the Hindu Kush region. Korsa, you can go ahead now.
Thank you very much. I'm so privileged to be here on this stage, sharing with so many amazing persons from around the world. And I'm feeling so happy to be here. So let me position myself first. So I'm coming all the way from mountain areas, the highest mountains of Pakistan and Hindu Kush Himalayas, where we do have all the highest peaks, including Mount Everest, K2. Just like the highest peaks, we have highest level of issues as well in reality, because whenever we talk about the realities, we believe that, and our research also shows that it's only the numbers which counts, and because in our areas we are less in number, so we don't get into the pictures normally in national pictures as well as in regional pictures. So having said that, we all are agreeing that climate change is a global emergency that reaches beyond national borders, impacts both human and natural systems. Rising temperature changes in precipitation patterns and an increased incidence of hazards have clear and severe impacts on the poorest and most marginalized communities like us, further compounding social and gender inequalities. Why I am focusing on social? Because with all the social gender realities in our HKH region, Hindu Kush Himalaya region, we do have issues related to religion. We are divided into various religious parts. We do have a very strong caste system in our region. Then we do have a class, of course, is there, and then sex-based politics is also there. So all these issues, when they intersect with gender, then the situation gets worsened, and that is what we have seen so far. So South Asia and the Hindu Kush Himalayas are among the regions that are most vulnerable to the impact of change. And we have seen so many incidents in the past, but currently you must all have heard about the Pakistan floods. So till now, millions of people are houseless and millions of people are still suffering. For 3 months, their houses, livelihood is still underwater. So we can understand that what situation on the ground could be for women or for poor or for those who are marginalized based on religion, sect, or so many factors. So the impact of climate change are leading to severe consequences such as increased food insecurity, which we are witnessing in Pakistan and elsewhere in South Asia, and especially for mountainous region where we do have very less land holdings, more or less water. Normally people say that maybe there will be no water or there will be water. For us, it's more water or less water. So both situations are creating a lot of issues. Energy crisis is there, although we do have a lot of water resources, but still people are still living without energy. Millions of people in South Asia still don't have access to electricity. So not even for cooking, cleaning, or other activities, even for lighting, we have millions of people still deprived of electric poverty. So these all inequalities are there. So for that, we need to create a cyclic relation. These consequences are also the root cause of climate vulnerability. Reducing climate risk demands that we address these root causes. An understanding of gender inequality and social inclusion, among other issues, is central to understand people's capacities to cope with and adapt to climate change. Induce impacts, including recognizing the prevalence of patriarchal systems. As I will also focus and emphasize on patriarchal systems that around the world, South Asia is the one of the region where patriarchal systems are very strong and the strongest, I must say. So there are gender differences in the severity of climate change impact and ability to adopt. Women and girls are more vulnerable to climate change and its impact. And our adaptive capacities are very limited. Climate change is further widening the gender gap and worsening existing social inequalities due to inadequate access to land and control over productive resources, as my other friends and colleagues and other speakers also said, that we don't have access to or control over productive resources. Also, in some of the countries of South Asia, you must know about, for instance, for Afghanistan and Pakistan, there is in other countries as well, the mobility of women and girls is so limited, and all these factors are worsening the situation, and the voice in decision making is also a concern. So women living in poverty are most vulnerable to water, food, energy insecurities in all these areas. So although women are doing quite a lot, as other speakers also mentioned, that we are there to handle all the situation, whether good or bad, but when we look at the policy landscape, we do say that our women should be there to make decision, and we should have space on tables where there comes the policies of national level or international level. When we see the policies, recently we had a very thorough assessment with UN Women and other agencies of all these South Asian countries. There we saw that how women are neglected in national policies. Although NDCs and all the climate change related policies are ambitious, but when it comes to all these sectoral based policies, women are nowhere. Most policy documents lack explicit provisions for addressing the specific vulnerabilities of women across sectors and the inequalities that result for prevailing and unequal norms, roles, and relations. While there are good examples related to GC policy implementation from South Asia, for instance, Nepal is leading, but they are very few and far between. When we also check about look at the institutional landscape or institutional mechanism, there also we see that only men are dominating in each and every sector. Although in agriculture sector, within Pakistan, we usually stereotype that maybe women are sitting at home in Pakistan or Afghanistan doing nothing, but there you will see more than 75% women are engaged in all these sectors, or especially in agriculture. But when it comes to get a benefit out of it, it goes through men only. So all these sectors are dominated by men. And when we see the capacities and skills of women in our area, in our region, in HKH countries, there also we see that all these technical positions as well as trainings goes to men, because women are supposed to do all the household chores or traditional activities. So these all are the situation of HKH in South Asia, not different from other countries, but I must again say that our situation is more difficult just because of religious, social, and cultural barriers to women who are facing on a daily basis. Yesterday, we hear that in Afghanistan, women and girls are banned from public places, especially from parks. So we can think of situation in Afghanistan and in some parts of Pakistan as well, that how women are suffering, not only from disaster, but from man-made disaster also. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cor Sobrano. Our next question will go to our panelist, Jolene, Chief of Staff of Clean Cooking. Cooking brings all dimensions to our nexus and the nexus we are talking about. We need water, we need energy, we need agricultural products to feed the world. Could you elaborate from your perspective the role of clean cooking in our nexus? In particular, when we talk about gender equality and women's empowerment.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm always humbled and inspired to be amongst such incredible women who are dedicated day in and day out to designing and implementing solutions that improve the lives of women around the world. And I think it's very fitting that we put the challenges and opportunities that we're discussing this evening in the context of cooking, which is a fundamental activity that has profound impacts on women, health, the climate, and our environment. And today, 2.4 billion people lack access to clean cooking solutions, relying on traditional polluting sources, as many of the stories that we've heard today, costing the world more than $2.4 trillion in economic damage to the climate, local economies, and contributing to more than 3 million premature deaths each year. This is not a small challenge. Every year, cooking with solid fuels produces as much climate-harming emissions as the global airline industry, including more than half of human-generated black carbon emissions coming from household energy. Up to 34% of wood fuel harvested is done so unsustainably, and we've been hearing stories from the countries here of what that stark reality looks like on the ground. The impacts on forest degradation, on desertification, the impact on soils and water systems, our ability to grow food, to sustain life, to protect nature and biodiversity. Put simply, lack of access to clean cooking is the most underinvested health and environmental challenge in the world. And women, unfortunately, bear the disproportionate burden of this cost in the form of poor health, safety, as well as lost productivity and well-being. But again, this is not a narrative of victimhood. Women are essential to the widespread adoption of clean cooking. They are critical in terms of deploying solutions, and accelerating access to clean cooking is one of the most accessible tools we have for empowering women and advancing gender equality. We cannot underestimate the agency of women as household decision makers and consumers, and their role as innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, and policymakers. They are essential to developing the enabling environment that allows us to grow an industry that can deliver clean cooking solutions that women actually want, have access to, and can afford. So we know that changing the way women cook will slow climate change, will drive gender equality, reduce poverty, provide enormous health and environmental benefits. Yet the level of funding and investment in the clean cooking sector has not matched the magnitude of the challenge, instead hovering in the tens of millions of dollars, far from the $10 billion a year that's required to achieve universal access to clean cooking. So there really is no better solution, no better example of a Nexus solution than clean cooking. And as founding signatories of this Gender and Energy Compact, we firmly believe that the compact and what it stands for creates a framework for gender lens investors, for donors, for organizations to focus on immediate impacts that can unlock other holistic solutions. We're speaking about agriculture, we're speaking about land tenure, land use, we're speaking about water and human rights. And there's no way that we can achieve our climate, development, or just transition goals until we free a third of the world's population, a third of the world's women from the drudgery and the dangers of polluting cooking, and empower them through solutions that are designed with them, for them, and in a way that they can access and integrate into their daily lives, not done in isolation as a separate issue. Household energy, household food, household livelihoods, they are all connected. And at the moment, the international system, organizations and donors are tackling these as separate issues. Access to electricity is making much greater progress, but access to electricity we know does not equate to access to clean cooking. There are billions of dollars being committed to nature-based solutions and to regenerative agriculture. we need that money to be combined with holistic solutions so that the women who are the smallholder farmers responsible for growing 80% of the world's food also have access to clean energy to cook their own food with. So my call to action today would be to direct our investment, to direct our energies into the near-term immediate solutions like clean cooking that will allow us to make progress in some of these other larger, bigger infrastructure, bigger agricultural transformation practices. But we will not make progress on those until we empower women and free them with clean cooking solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. We must do this holistically. We must channel finances from these other nexuses and make this work. We don't have to start looking at them and continue looking at them in isolation. Our next speaker, and the only male on our panel, is Garrett Phillips. Garrett is a Climate Finance Division Manager. So this is a very good time to segue into the finances. Garrett, very often women are limited and have limited access to or ownership of assets, finance, markets, infrastructure, and skills. Are the current investments, or there will be, or have you heard of any current investments that are between these nexuses of water, energy, food, that is gender smart?
So thank you very much indeed for having me on the panel and for the question. It's been very interesting listening, to the moving stories from my panelists and our keynote speaker. And I was struck when Elizabeth talked about the impact of education and contraception on women in the context of greenhouse gas emissions. And yet here we're talking about the nexus between health and food and energy and water. And these topics are related to adaptation. And it really struck me how indoctrinated we are to think about financing these activities through mitigation. And we're missing out on a huge opportunity here because the international financial architecture is very well structured to help support large-scale mitigation projects, renewable energy projects, transport projects, and so on. But it's not suitable for the kinds of projects that we need to do, and that we've been hearing about here, and where the demand is here, clean cooking and the technologies that for agriculture and so on. These are small-scale, context-specific actions that have adaptation benefits. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that right now, parties are waking up to the need to provide resources for adaptation. In Glasgow last year, the donors pledged to double the amount of adaptation finance available, and even this year we've seen more pledges coming forward. But the problem is we still don't have mechanisms that enable us to finance these kinds of adaptation projects. Actually, for me, it's even more disappointing to hear a big push coming from world leaders to focus more on the voluntary carbon markets and voluntary emission reductions, because actually financing adaptation is the key to addressing many of the problems that we're talking about here. Clean cooking, off-grid energy access, water, and so on. All of these technologies make households, communities, and economies more resilient to climate change and better adapted. Now, the problem is how do we use adaptation, or how do we finance adaptation? And of course, I'm saying this because at the African Development Bank, we're working on a solution to address this problem, and it's called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. Now, at this point, usually I dive off and get extremely technical and lose my audience, so I'm going to keep it very high level. What we want to do is invite corporates and donors and philanthropies and funds to commit to purchase, and then follow that commitment up with actually purchasing what we call certified adaptation benefits. Now, then the difference, so you say this sounds like buying certified emission reductions or voluntary emission reductions. The difference is that different adaptation projects deliver different types of adaptation benefits. They're not all the same. They're not fungible. And so the analogy we have is that we want to create what we call the adaptation supermarket. And we want to have our registered adaptation projects advertising their adaptation benefits for sale in the adaptation supermarket. And we want to invite the developed country parties and the donors, corporate entities, philanthropies, and so on, to come to the adaptation supermarket and pick the projects that they want to support. They can pick clean cooking in Malawi. They can they can pick climate resilient agriculture in Mozambique. They can do climate resilient cocoa production in Cote d'Ivoire. Whatever they want to do, whatever they align with, they pick it. And there's a price associated with that. The price is different across all the different technologies. What matters is how much money they spend in the adaptation supermarket. The more money they spend, the more we get to report, the more money we mobilize. So they will commit to buying the adaptation benefits from the project. And the project developers, they take that legally binding commitment on their registered project, and they can then go to a green bank or a development bank or a local commercial bank to borrow the money that they need to implement the project. And our job as an MDB is to put those financial instruments in place, to create the green banks, to put the lines of credit, to put the guarantees in place in case the projects don't deliver, so that people can lend to the projects. So the project developers, they have their registered document and their adaptation benefit supply agreement. They go to the bank, they borrow the money, they implement the project, and then they deliver the certified adaptation benefits and they get paid. And with that money, they make some profit and they pay back their loan. Now, the reason why I've gone into the technical aspects of that a little bit is that it's very relevant for women and youth. In the model that I've described, the only two things you need to mobilize the finance are documents that we create through the provision of technical assistance and some expertise. You don't need collateral. You don't need to own land. You don't need to have a track record of successful project experience. What women and youth as well, what they bring that we need for these projects are other things. They bring indigenous technical knowledge. They bring access to land, labor, entrepreneurial spirit. And very importantly, in the case of women, they often bring access to biodiversity, because women are the custodians of much of the biodiversity that we have. And these are the essential ingredients of adaptation projects alongside the money. So it's the communities, the women, the cooperatives, the small, medium, micro enterprises in Africa who have those other elements. They just don't have the money. So the adaptation benefit mechanism can help them mobilize those resources so that they can implement the projects. And if we just take one example of planting trees, and we heard also this great example, I think it was again Elizabeth talked about the, I did write the name down but I can't see it, about from the 1970s, this community and group that were planting lots of trees. If you try to plant trees as a carbon sequestration activity, it's a great thing to do. But it's extremely complicated. There's a huge amount of effort goes into the monitoring and verification, the collecting of data. It takes a long time. We don't know what the carbon price is going to be in 15 years. And finally, it drives arguments over ownership of land and who has the right to it. If you approach that same technology as an adaptation point of view, actually, we can say that after 3, 4, 5 years, the communities living in those areas where the trees are planted, they are now more adapted to climate change. We don't need to wait 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We don't need to keep paying for the carbon that's sequestered. We can pay the costs of planting those trees when you can see them from the satellite. And you pay for doing that, and then you can move on and do the next project, instead of sitting on a carbon project where you continually try to sell the carbon again and again and create a sort of a cash cow model where you continually get money from something that is already paid off. So it's a very interesting example, and here now I'm getting too technical again. Let me come back to the high level. We want to invite developed country parties and donors to commit to or to adopt an adaptation project and to pay for the costs of implementing that, so that women and youth and men and communities and micro, small and medium enterprise can mobilize the resources that they need to implement adaptation projects. And it speaks directly to the examples that we've been hearing here in the health, food, energy, water nexus. Thank you very much.
I think a lot of time when we hear finance people, they tell us what they're likely to do, but I think he's broken it down and told us, he's given us a plan on how they're going to put the adaptation supermarket together and what is going to happen and how they are encouraging donors and partners to adopt this so that and pay for these structures so that they can support it. They've also removed barriers that our former speaker spoke about, the barriers that take people away from access for women, so you just need your documentation to be able to access these things. I think that's a great initiative for the AfDB to actually see through, and we would all want to support and rally around this very carefully. So at this point, we want to speak and hear from our audience. If you have any questions for our esteemed panelists, so there's once in a while we get to hear from them throughout the year. So let us, if you have any questions. Okay, there's a question right there. Please introduce yourself and then you can ask your question.
Sure. Hi, my name is Nadja Hahn. I'm a journalist from Austrian Public Radio. I would like to know, in this conference, a big topic is that the rich nations in the north should help the south with adaptation, with loss and damage. We all know that. What would you like to see in the outcome of this COP27 that would make the situation of women better?
So we'll take, if there's no other question, we'll who would you like to target the question to? Would you have somebody in mind you want to target the question to, or anybody on the panel can answer?
I think one lady is offering her.
Okay.
I forgot your name, I'm sorry, but I recognize you would like to reply. And
Okay.
maybe the lady from the World Food Program as well?
Okay, thank you. Is there another question?
I also have a question myself.
Okay.
And hi, everyone. I'm Kathy, Youth Advisor at UNIDO and also from the Global Center on Adaptation. And my question is really to Gareth, because for some of you in the audience might know that the Global Center on Adaptation and AfDB has been working a lot together on youth-led adaptation solutions and empowerment, especially focusing on Africa. And Stephanie has been one of the very active members that we engage with. So just curious in terms of whether, in your view, what can your team or other MDBs do to learn from the good practice of this GCA-AfDB collaboration and to have these more partnerships to support youth, especially girls, working on adaptation, especially at a local level. And would really love to hear your views or any other panelists if anyone else want to add. Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay, so we'll take the answers to the question for the first question and the second. And if you have any other question, you can ask us subsequently. Okay.
Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Stella Gama. I'm the lady in pink in the... Yes, thank you very much. There are so many outcomes I would wish for in this COP27, but I would focus on one. The UNFCCC process has a Lima work program on gender and also a gender action plan. At this COP, we are doing an intermediary review of the Lima work program on gender and the gender action plan. These two, especially the gender action plan, it is very ambitious. It's looking at gender balance in the UNFCCC. It's looking at strategies and measures to achieve gender responsive policies and actions. It is also looking at strategies and measures on how we can achieve or we can attain women empowerment and effective participation of women in the process, and also on local level actions. It's very ambitious, but after 3 years of implementation, what is it that we have achieved? So for me, we need to assess what we have achieved, what we have not been able to achieve, and what are the challenges where we have not been able to achieve the ambition that we laid out 2 years or 3 years ago. One of the major challenges that has been highlighted is financing of the Gender Action Plan. There are also other challenges which have to do with capacity. And sometimes, for example, if we look at gender balance or effective women participation in the process, it is also to do with issues of normal confidence for women to participate effectively. Do they have leadership skills for women to participate effectively? And what are the things that we need to do to ensure that women participate effectively? So for me, the intermediary review should look at the ambition that we set. Where are the good lessons, good practices for the things that we have achieved? For example, in the constituted bodies, there are some constituted bodies which have got a gender balance, and some have got a higher number of women. For example, if we look at the Adaptation Committee, would have gender balance. But if we look at the Technology Executive Committee, there are only 2 women now in the Technology Executive Committee. So it means we have not achieved that goal of gender balance in the Technology Executive Committee. So what is it that we need to do? Encourage women to participate in these bodies, encourage parties to nominate women into these bodies. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. The good practices, let's maintain them. Where there are challenges, let's see how we can strategize so that in the next 5 years of the Gender Action Plan, we should at least achieve above 80% of the ambition we laid in the action plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just a quick intervention as well. Is the World Food Programme, we are here advocating for vulnerable communities on the front lines of climate change. And one of the interventions that we're really pushing for is adaptation and early warning, because it is actually the most cost-effective way than coming in after a disaster and a crisis. And we know now the Secretary General of the United Nations gave a statement. We know it's going to, adaptation needs financing is going to get to as much as $340 billion per year by 2030. And he's even calling that all climate financing, at least 50% of that should go towards adaptation. And so this is what we're advocating for, to make sure that, prevention is better than cure, as that we are there much earlier so that communities don't have to, be left in these catastrophic situations when we've acted too late.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Sorry, just very quickly, loss and damage is a climate justice issue, and so hopefully something gets done with regard to loss and damage, a financing facility, and however it looks like, it has to fulfill the following criteria. It has to be gender just, it has to be accessible, it has to be inclusive, it has to allow these communities to have ownership over the money, because these communities, they're the ones who know best how to rehabilitate, how to recover, and how to bounce back from all of these climate disasters that they have been personally experiencing on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you as well. So to our second question, Kathy, is your question answered? You would like to repeat the question?
Yeah, Gareth?
Yep. So I can respond, thank you. Indeed, the African Development Bank has partnered with the Global Centre on Adaptation to launch the African Adaptation Acceleration Programme. It's a very ambitious programme to double the amount of adaptation finance coming to the African continent from $12.5 to $25 billion by 2025. There are 4 pillars in the AAAP. Digital solutions for food security and agriculture, the youth-led adaptation, resilient infrastructure, and the innovative financial initiatives pillar. And actually, the adaptation benefits mechanism is one of the instruments that we put under the 4th pillar. I think, so that's a quick introduction to the AAAP. I think the lessons learned and what others can take from this is the impact that, announcing an initiative like this with such a large scale target, such a big target, and something that our president and, the community, the financial community could coalesce around. It focuses attention and it helps us raise resources. And actually, following on from the African Adaptation Acceleration Programme, at the African Development Bank, we are now developing what we call the Climate Action Window. And sorry, this is getting again into the detail. This is within the 16th replenishment of the Africa Development Fund. The ADF is a development fund that provides concessional finance for development activities to the 37 most vulnerable countries in Africa. The Climate Action Window will provide concessional funding for climate action projects, for high-impact climate projects in the 37 countries. And I think that the latest news is that as much as 75% of the Climate Action Window will be dedicated to adaptation actions in those 37 countries in recognition of the challenge that they're facing. And that's going to filter into all the kinds of projects that we've been talking about here. So I think there's a lot to be learned, many advantages from taking on such ambitious targets as this, because it raises ambition, it helps us set targets, move forward, mobilize finance, and set our sights high. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do our online panelists will have something to say? Want to add anything? I think Brandy, you have something to say? Okay, can we turn on her mic?
I do. Just to add to this as well, because it's so important. I often speak about togetherness, and with the theme and me looking right now at the panel of being together for implementation, it's fantastic. We have to set bold goals, and togetherness is not passive. We have to actively make sure that we are being inclusive of all of the voices. Women from Malawi, women from Afghanistan, women from Pakistan, all throughout the entire leadership realms, if we are going to measure success and make sure that these solutions are making the impact that they are designed to have. And we can't necessarily do that through the same system that we have been operating within. As much as we need to make sure that we are opening opportunities for complete uplifting of women's voices in order to be effective in this, we also have to make sure that we are rising and taking those opportunities. And our current societal and cultural programming is for us to not necessarily take those roles. So whether that's in our businesses, in our programs, in our policies, we have to actively be in the practice of looking for how we can make sure that we're opening up those opportunities for all of those voices to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. Okay, of course, for a few
come
minutes.
in?
Yes, please, for a
Yeah.
few minutes.
Thank
Yes.
you very much for giving me space in this. So everything has been discussed very nicely. One thing I want to reiterate that one role which is very essential for survival of humanity or even this planet, that is reproductive role. And we don't say that. With all these points I'm echoing, but the reproductive role, we want to make it a very important part, an integral part of all these adaptation strategies. And I would really love to listen that reproductive role of women or anyone is facilitated, supported, and given proper role in economies. And rather we should, or we have to change the definition of economy also, that we have to focus all these roles and give incentives through social protection, through cash transfer. We do have already in all countries from all these amazing donors, but the strategy need to be changed a bit towards those to facilitate women, especially from marginalized areas, to make a difference here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corsair. And I would like our panelists to say just a few seconds. If you've said it already, you don't have to. Just a few last lines, few seconds so we can close up. Our time is up.
Yes. So just one thing to say, that I think everything we're discussing here really comes down to gender inequality. And at the core of that is power. You know, gender equality is just that. It's about power, who has it, how they use it, and for whose benefit. And I think we've had all the speakers here echo the same thing, that we need women in decision-making position, making decisions that benefit women. And here's the good news. When it works for women, it works for all of society, right? Because even on the African continent, you know, the majority of the smallholder farmers are women. Just imagine what's possible if they have the same access to assets and tools and resources. And then just a final thing, what gets measured gets done. I think one of the biggest gaps is making sure that we have the gender data. We are so focused on this as the World Food Program in terms of making sure that we are measuring the gender dimension and capturing that data. We have a hunger map, a live tool that, you know, we are using for that. So I think just making sure we're aggregating the data, we understand the needs of the communities, because without data, really all you have is an opinion.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Anybody else? Very quickly.
Say one last word. We've heard such amazing stories and really a call for continued mentorship and support and rising women through the ranks. We talk about the gap and the need to fill, but we need to build capacity. We need to provide opportunities. We need to create spaces for shared learning and knowledge transfer so that we're not alone in solving these challenges. Whatever our focus areas and wherever the world we are, we need to connect. And women do the connecting in their families, in their communities, in their sectors, wherever they are. And we need to create those spaces and continue to mentor. And if you have an amazing mentor that's helped you along the way, you have the responsibility of mentoring someone below you as well and bringing that through. And that's the only way we're going to get the momentum that we need to get the equality and solve these challenges together. So
Thank you
please
so
connect.
much. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you so much. We are out of time, everyone. So please give a round of applause for our esteemed panelists. They've done really well. They've given us insight. We know we have to handle this wholeheartedly. We need to be very inclusive. We need to be deliberate about inclusion. It makes business sense to do that. And AfDB is looking for donors and support to support the Adaptation supermarket. So now we can come together and take a group photo. Yeah. Yes, so that we
Also,
don't
a
miss
round
out
of
on it.
applause for our awesome moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Terry, can you please join us? So we take a quick group photo. I think in front here it's better. Yes, we take a photo.